Well, good evening, and it's a pleasure for us to be cooperating with Calgary Opera. It's a pleasure to be here. This is an exciting event. It's the second time that Mary Jo Leddy has been in Calgary. How many of you knew that? Or at least that she's brought Christian thought lectures in Calgary? Good. A number of you, obviously, heard her the first time around. So welcome to everybody to this Christian thought lecture. It's an exciting thing to bring academic study of religion into the real world, the world of politics, the world of decision-making. And the lectures tonight and tomorrow, Dr. Leddy is going to be doing some of that. She's going to be putting shoe leather to Christian values and to Christian thinking. The way that this event will unfold this evening is that we're giving Dr. Leddy about an hour to share her thoughts on this interesting topic with us. And then that'll be followed by some questions. And so please, if you have some questions, take note of them and be ready to raise them at the end of her hour of speaking. And then there will be this opportunity afterwards to mingle as well. I do have a sign-up sheet if you'd like to learn more about Christian Thought events. There is one more event in March as well. Just sign the sign-up sheet, which will be next door as well, and you'll be notified of future lectures. It is my pleasure to introduce Mary Jo Leddy once again to Calgary. And she and I both wish that she could stay a little bit longer. She flew in this morning. She flies out tomorrow. But we do have her for these 24 hours. Mary Jo Leddy is the director of the Romero House Community for Refugees in Toronto. And at the same time, she's an adjunct professor at Regis College, the University of Toronto, where she teaches at least one course per semester. She has the PhD from University of Toronto in philosophy of religion, where she studied with Emil Fackenheim and Gregory Baum. In her doctoral work, her thesis was on Hannah Arendt's approach to the Holocaust. In her writings, Mary Jo Leddy has sought to address peace and social justice issues in Canada. She's offered several books that promote those kinds of themes. At the Border Called Hope, and her next book, God and Caesar at the 49th Parallel. That'll be actually the topic tomorrow on campus at the University of Calgary at noon hour in the Nickel Arts Museum. So join me now in welcoming Dr. Leddy. Her topic now is Canada chooses between two kinds of societies. This is actually a theme from Margaret Clarkson, a punishing society or a forgiving society. Welcome, Mary Jo.
Thank you very much, Doug, and it's really an honor to be here in the political capital of Canada. And even more of an honor to be associated with the work of Sister Helen Preja, Dead Man Walking, and the wonderful initiative to have the opera and to have all these events surrounding it. It's a wonderful public opportunity to engage in ethical and moral questions of substance and beauty. So the inspiration for this talk this evening comes from a quotation in the installation speech of Governor General Adrienne Clarkson. I remember distinctly the October night in 1999, as I was driving home from teaching at the university, listening to As It Happens on CBC, and hearing the installation speech being played. And I pulled over to the side of the road to listen to it. I thought, this is a speech. This is something we need to listen to. There seem to be two kinds of societies in the world today. Perhaps there have always been only two kinds: punishing societies and forgiving societies. A society like Canada's, with its 4 centuries of give and take, compromise and acceptance, wrongdoing and redress, is basically a forgiving society. We try, we must try to forgive the past. The punishing society never forgets the wrongs of the past. The forgiving society works towards the actions of the future. The forgiving society enables people to behave well towards one another, to begin again, to build a society in hope and with love. Adrienne Clarkson's words struck me then and strike me now. And they're so profound and so moving that I want to spend this time I have with you reflecting further on what it might mean for us now. And it is interesting for me to note that some of the finest thinking and finest speeches in the country over the last several years have come not from our politicians, but from our two women governor generals. I want to begin by sharing with you 5 experiences that I have had that made me pull over to the side of the road and to take account of what the Governor General was saying. The first experience comes from that of my own family. We are Irish Catholics who were forced to come to Canada because of the violence and injustice in Ireland. On my father's side of the family, and he used to remind us always, you come from a long line of Irish kings who drove the Vikings out of Ireland. It was all part of it, you know, Blarney. But from my father's side of the family, we grew up with a very clear sense that we had been wronged, that it was the English who slaughtered us at Drogheda. It was the English who drove us to Connaught. We had been wronged, and they were the evil ones, and they deserved to be punished. They deserved no sympathy. However, from my mother's side of the family, things were not that simple. She came from the soldiers of Cromwell who had married Irish girls and who had then become landowners and had raised Protestant and Catholic children. And the Protestant fathers started the first national school in Ireland so their children could go to school. And my mother used to say to me, because of this background, now Mary Jo, you have to understand the difference between the English and the Irish. The English, when a castle falls to ruins, they fix it up and make a tourist attraction out of it. And the Irish, when the castle falls to ruin, they sit beside it and they drink and they write poetry. But they all had to leave. They had to leave the cycle of violence that engulfed that country. My mother's family lived in an area near Macroom called Ambush Country. And the white boys came down from the hills and attacked the British brigades. And then the British brigades picked up the Catholic men, put tar on their heads, and set them on fire until they went crazy. And then their sons attacked the British again, and then they went out and burned the crops and took the children. And the cycle of violence escalated and escalated until people, like my family, had to leave the cycle of recrimination and revenge and come to Canada and make a new beginning. The second experience that has shaped me is growing up in the West, Western Canada. I grew up on the banks of the South Saskatchewan River in Saskatoon. And part of my very early education, as I remember it, was learning about the ways in which we had been wronged by the East, by Toronto, by Bay Street. And I knew my mother's family was from there, but somehow they were different and not like those Easterners. And we had it down pat. There was someone, there was something to blame for everything that was wrong in our lives. And we lived on that wound, I think. What they had done to us, we felt slighted and shortchanged. Now, fortunately, I think, I also grew up with a sense of what was so right about the West. When we would go out and help our neighbors with the harvest, and the land would be vast and beautiful before us, and we would see ourselves along the thin line between earth and heaven. And in the winter, in the city, we learned what it meant to be part of a community. We were proud of our hockey teams and football teams and loyal to them, proud of our small theaters and art galleries. But the line between us and them began to blur for me when I went to Toronto to do graduate studies. I discovered not a them, but a city full of neighborhoods that were every bit as much little communities as the place that I had grown up. Communities of concern that were far more critical of Bay Street than anything I had heard in Saskatoon. Communities that also mocked those snobby little English people from Upper Canada. And so I would travel back and forth between East and West and between us and them, hearing the same old, same old. Westerners talking about Toronto, and Toronto not talking about the West, because it was just on the way to the coast. And I began to realize, sadly, how easy it would be for the Torontonians and the Westerners to let each other freeze in the dark because of some memory, some long, deep memory on the one hand, or on the other hand, no memory at all. The third experience that has shaped my perception of what Adrian Clarkson was saying was the experience of studying the Holocaust, the time when 6 million innocent people were murdered, not for what they did, but because of who they were. And their innocence is all the more magnified, or became magnified in my mind, as I realized that 1.5 million of them were children. And I thought, surely these innocent ones cry out for punishment, for justice. At first, I thought, as I began to study, that the Nazis were some kind of demonic creature, not like me, and not like you, but deranged. Hitler was a demon, a devil. And then, as I began to study the transcripts of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, the consummate bureaucrat, and read Hannah Arendt's description of the trial of Adolf Eichmann, it slowly dawned on me, and this was a terrifying thought. This is a normal person. This is a human being. A human being did this, not a demon. A really thoughtless little man. A bureaucrat who was terrifyingly normal. And that thought stunned me. The Nazis, there may have been a few who were really vicious criminals. Most of them were rather ordinary people, caught up in something, thoughtlessly. And the real problem wasn't even them, as I began to see it. It was all the good people who did nothing. And all the good people who simply by participating in systems, making trains run, publishing schedules, all the good people who by doing a good job had contributed to enormous evil. And what kind of punishment would be fitting, not for an Eichmann, but for all the good people? And was forgiveness even possible? I remember reading the book by Simon Wiesenthal, a book called The Sunflower, in which he recounts his experience as a young man being in a concentration camp and some Nazi guards coming to get him and asking him to come to the hospital ward in the concentration camp. And he went in, they led him into a small room, and there was a young man lying in bandages on a bed, and he was left alone with this young German man. And the man said to him, "I am dying. I don't have long to live. I am a Christian. I was raised to be a good Christian. But I was caught up in the Eastern Front, and I was ordered to order my men to round up villagers into a barn and to set it on fire. I feel I did something terribly wrong. And I want you as a Jew to forgive me." And so in telling this story, Wiesenthal poses the question, and what would you have done? Would you have offered forgiveness? And at the end of the book, Wiesenthal says, "I walked out. I did not offer forgiveness because I felt I could not forgive in the name of all the people who had been killed in the barn." In studying the Holocaust, I felt that there may be crimes that we can neither punish nor forgive in any normal sense. The fourth experience that has shaped my response has been the privilege in the last 15 years of my life of living and working with refugees in a small project called Romero House in Toronto. It's named after Archbishop Romero, and it's actually 4 small houses and a little storefront in a small neighborhood of Toronto. I've lived during this 15 years with people from all over the world. People who've been forced to flee, as my mother's family was, from all the great conflicts, the great cycles of punishment and revenge and violence. And as I've lived with the people who've run for their lives, and in who many ways have had to leave their lives behind, the questions of punishment and forgiveness have pressed themselves upon my heart. And I'm really grateful, Doug, for the invitation to speak tonight, because it's kind of forced me to pull together what I've actually been thinking about all the time. In almost every case, people that I live with have been crushed by cycles of revenge and blame. A Sinhalese unit in Sri Lanka goes to the Tamil north and burns a village. And then the Tamil Tigers go south to a tea plantation near Kandy. And they burn it and they rape the women. And then the Sinhalese paramilitaries go again to the north and pick up the young men and torture them. And most die. And some live. One or two might come to us, but the rest plot their revenge and the punishment that they will exact. Innocent people are caught up in this vortex which sucks life out of the present, which deprives them of any possibility of hope in the future. I've just finished the manuscript of another book. It's before the God and Caesar book, which I wrote actually out at the Banff Center for the Arts in May. And the title of the book is whimsically called Our Friendly Local Terrorist. And it's a true story of somebody I know very well, a young Kurdish man who has been in Canada for 15 years. He grew up in the hill country of Turkey in the east, happy and poor and bright, and a soccer star. And when he was at university, he was picked up by the Turkish military, accused of being a threat to the Turkish national security, and tortured very badly. And he left the prison limping. But it wasn't just his feet that were affected. It was his heart and his soul. He fled to Canada, arrived in Toronto, was accepted as a refugee before a board who recognized his need for protection. And then he started getting visits from CSIS, the Canadian Security Intelligence Committee. And they started to interrogate him. Where are you? What have you done? Have you built bombs? Are you plotting against the Turkish state? And every time he was questioned, the memory of the previous interrogation came back. And at one point, he asked me to go to one of these interviews. And in the middle of the interview, the CSIS officer said to him, "If you become a spy for us, we'll give you your papers, and if you don't, you'll never see them." And I was there. And I became the witness. And he said, I can't do that. I can speak for myself. But this is Canada, this is not Turkey. He made a complaint, a formal complaint, to the tribunal, the watchdog that oversees CSIS. And they said, this is an innocent man, give him his papers. And they said they wouldn't. And so we went then to the federal court. And again, the federal court ruled, this is an innocent man, give him his papers. And so finally, CSIS and Immigration Canada said, all right, they said we had to give him his papers, but they didn't say when. So 15 years have passed. His latest thing now is he's doing a civil suit for damages for several $1 million for the 15 lost years that he has not been able to work in his profession, has not been able to get married because of the insecurity, or have children. And he is totally focused on this court case, as he has been for the last 10 years. And so in desperation, I decided to write his story, and that's the book that will be coming out soon. But we've had many conversations. And I've been worried about him because I said, Suleiman, you have to let go of this. It's driving you crazy. It's all you think about. He said, but they've never said they're wrong. I'm going to punish them. They're going to have to pay millions for what they've done to me and the others. That's justice. And I said, yes, it's justice. And maybe, 10 years from now, you will get several million, probably you will. And you will have achieved a great victory. But what about your life? It's like they're inside your head now. It's all you can think about. Now, I want to say one thing. Fortunately, what happened to him in Turkey, he knows, was done by a certain paramilitary group. He has many Turkish friends. So he has that balance. But I've said, I worry about you. It's like it's inside your head now. And I spoke to him about the story of the liberation of the Jews from Egypt. That Moses said to Pharaoh, let my people go. But then the people wander through the desert, and scripture scholars often ask, why did they have to wander so long, 40 years? And one of the answers the rabbis gave was, because it took 40 years for them to let Pharaoh go. It's one thing for Pharaoh to let you go, but for you to let Pharaoh go. If you've worked in the brickyard that long, you're looking at Pharaoh, and at some point, Pharaoh gets inside your head. And to be free, you have to let Pharaoh go. So in the conversations, as I've tried to work this out with this very difficult, ornery young man, older now, I've said, it's not about forgetting what happened. It's not about making it better. But somehow you have to be able to remember in a way that lets you live now. So I said, listen, get married, have 10 children, It will drive them crazy. CSIS agents will be at your wedding and they'll be so upset that you're having a good time, that you're living, that they haven't been able to stop this. And then he'll laugh and say, "Oh, do you think so?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Try 3 or 4 wives." Live. Because you see, what constantly happens is that the past threatens to overdetermine the future. What has been the wrong done, and it is wrong, threatens to determine both the present and the future. In the midst of these many conversations, I consulted a psychiatrist at the Canadian Centre for Victims of Torture. And he said to me very simply, he will never be free until he forgives. I said, but it's not possible. The people in Canada and Turkey who did this to him, they will never admit this. They will never say they're sorry. And the psychiatrist said to me, it doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter. It's for his own sake. He needs to let go of this. Not to forget, but to remember in a different way and to walk along beside what has happened to him. This kind of dilemma is experienced not just by individuals, but by whole groups of people, Croatians and Serbs, Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda, Palestinians and Israelis, if you've seen the film Munich. The vortex of violence, of punishment and counter-punishment. In Canada, the wrongs that have been done to the Aboriginal peoples, the people of Quebec, Japanese Canadians, Chinese people, and the head tax, Italian Canadians, wrongs have been done, and the question is, and now what can we do? And fifthly and finally, an experience of teaching in a theology school. There are many women there. I have had several conversations with women who have been abused as children, as adults. And it's very moving to hear them as they begin to move beyond forgetting or denying and to say, this has happened to me. I am a victim of abuse, or I am a survivor of abuse. That's astonishing. And it's even more astonishing when this kind of conversation happens, as it has with one woman I can remember in particular. She said, yes, I have been abused, but I have come to the point where I no longer see myself as a victim. I now say, I am a person who has met evil. In other words, something happened, something terrible, something wrong, but it does not define me. It is part of me, but it is not who I am. So these various experiences from individual lives and groups and so on, press upon me reflections about the differences between punishing societies and forgiving societies, because these are two different responses to wrongdoing, a wrong that has been done. So first, some reflections on punishing societies. It strikes me that there is a very important affirmation in the heart of the whole notion of punishment. And that is that our actions have consequence. That when we do something, for better or for worse, there are consequences. And this seems to me an extremely important affirmation in a culture which is very light. As the novelist Milan Kundera calls it, we live with the unbearable lightness of being. So many people, young people, in this culture really don't believe that their lives matter, that they are consequential, that they are weighty, that they can make a difference for better or worse in this world. A punishing society says, basically, there are consequences for your actions. This is a statement of moral purpose, and it strikes me that it's important to say, if we cannot admit that we can do wrong, then neither will we be able to say, I can do good. I could do something very good in this world. I could make a difference. You see, the alternative is something, and I talk about this in my book, Radical Gratitude. The alternative is a sense of moral powerlessness, that we really don't think that what we do or say matters. And the terrible thing is that if we don't believe that we matter, it's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy, that we're going to think and act in ways that will in fact ensure that it doesn't really matter. However, in spite of that affirmation, there are tremendous risks for a society and for an organization to be organized around the whole notion of punishment. And let me explain just by an example about organizations. I'm sure you know of organizations, or perhaps you work in them, that are run by the whole fear of punishment. Employees are afraid of making a mistake because then they will be punished. Employees get very cautious, fearful. They begin to watch each other. They are hesitant. They become ineffective. Someone somewhere may have thought that punishment will make organization, or the threat of it, will make organizations more effective. But in fact, it tends to paralyze the people in the organization. In the various works that I've done, and I've had to deal with many government organizations, for example, I've seen how the fear of punishment, the fear of making a mistake, has absolutely paralyzed whole departments of a government. And the problem is compounded when there has, in fact, been a mistake. Somebody's immigration file is lost. And how that whole organization will spend thousands and thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours covering over the mistake because they're afraid of being punished, losing their job, being downgraded, or whatever. And it seems to me it would be such a simple thing to say, we lost the file, do you have a copy of it? And move on. Move on. Or if you mess up one day, wouldn't it be a relief if your boss just said, well, hopefully you can do better tomorrow? I mean, the whole organization would begin to function much better, it seems to me. Now, presumably, a society punishes wrongdoers because it wants to stop that, or at least correct the people who've done it. But the danger is that in punishing others, especially if the punishment becomes violent, unjust, vicious, that it can begin to affect the people who do the punishing. And we've seen all these wonderful, powerful TV series like Oz or Prison Break, in which the prison guards themselves begin to become corrupted by the whole system of punishment that is there. We as human beings tend to learn by imitation. If we see a lot of punishment in the home, in the school, in the jails, we tend to imitate that within our own lives. Societies cannot have institutions of punishment without that institution eventually beginning to affect a whole society. There are horrible cycles of punishment and violence that hold societies captive. And this is what Adrienne Clarkson is referring to. And it's when societies hold on to the wrong, groups in society hold on to the wrongs that have been done, and it begins to shape their identity. At the same time, it's dangerous to forget the past. And I think especially Christians have been told, forgive and forget. Sweep it under the carpet. Women have been told this. And what happens is that usually those who have done great wrong can continue to do so. When we say forgive and forget, we are also destroying the moral fiber of our society because we are saying your actions have no consequence. The memory of great wrongs continues today in this country among the Aboriginal peoples, in Quebec, for example. And there has been wrong done. But the worst thing that happens is when people begin to say, we have rights because we have been wronged. What happens then is that the group that has been wronged has to keep on feeling wronged, has to keep on seeing themselves as victims, and has to keep on seeing others as oppressing them. It's a very dangerous thing to base your rights on the experience of being wronged. People have rights because they are human beings, not because they're wronged. The danger in that is that what if the wrong stops? What happens to your right? People have human rights to be treated with dignity and respect because they're human beings. And this strikes me as absolutely crucial to remember in our society now. Let me say a little more about a forgiving society. Adrienne Clarkson says, "A punishing society never forgets the past. The forgiving society works towards the actions of the future." I gave an example of Suleiman, whose freedom is somehow tied up with the ability of not letting the past determine his present. There have been places recently where a country such as South Africa was able to engage in a process of truth and reconciliation, where there was a basic condition of peace, where those who had done wrong admitted publicly that they had done so. Those who had been victimized, it wasn't that everything was made well. You can't retrieve lives that are lost or lives that are diminished. But what that Truth and Reconciliation Commission made possible was the thought, the smallest thought, that maybe there could be a future together that is different from the past. I've been part of 2 efforts in Canada to become part of a forgiving society. And the first was my involvement in the efforts of Japanese Canadians to get redress. For a long, long time, Japanese Canadians who had been interned during the Second World War didn't want to speak about that. They were ashamed. They wanted to disappear. They wanted to be silent about this terrible wound. And then they began to speak about it, and my friend Joy Kogawa was part of this effort. And they went to Ottawa, and Ottawa issued an apology, formally gave some money to the Japanese community in recognition of what had been lost. It was a very moving moment. And I remember talking with Joy afterwards, and she said the biggest challenge for her was to begin now to stop thinking of herself as a victim. And she said once that happened, she began to feel like a moral person and to realize there were ways in which she too could do wrong to other people. As long as you feel a victim and you're innocent, it's hard to admit what you might do to others. I was also recently part of an amazing evening at a synagogue in Toronto when the Austrian ambassador to Canada had invited Jewish Austrian people now living in Canada to come and hear how the Austrian government wanted to offer them some compensation. And he spoke very simply to this group of elderly people, and he said, "Nothing we can give you will ever, ever compensate for everything you've lost. It's just a way of saying, we're sorry, and we hope we can have a better future together." And it was astonishing to me because the money being offered is not that large. But you could just see these people, survivors, standing up and straightening up and saying, "Thank you very much, and we wish you well." It was great, immense dignity in that moment. It doesn't take much. You can't make the past different, but to open up that window, that small window on the future. Now, just as final remark, and I think it's the most fundamental remark I want to make, I think I've been suggesting that there's something about punishment that's inherently consequential, that punishment could be constructive, sometimes it's not, it just adds to the violence in the world, that sometimes forgiveness is not authentic, but sometimes it is. And what is it that makes constructive punishment or authentic forgiveness possible? And it strikes me that these are possible for societies as we begin to grow beyond those divisions, and they're very old, between us and them. It's a very old worldview. In fact, it was called a heresy of Manichaeanism, that there are really two worlds. There's a world of light and a world of darkness, a world that's good and a world that's bad, and they're not mixed. They're completely separate. There's good societies and there's bad societies. There's good people and bad people. And it was really Augustine early on in the 4th century who said, no, those two worlds are in each one of us. The line between good and evil goes right through the middle of each of us. Right through the middle of every society. And he said there's no society so good that it doesn't have a shadow side. And there's no society so bad that it doesn't have some good possibility. And Hannah Arendt, in a very famous speech in Frankfurt after the Second World War, said something to that effect as she addressed a German audience. She said, "Let us never forget we are all human beings. You, Germans, you share in my innocence, and I share part of your guilt. It is not you and me, or us and them. That line, once we realize that, once we get beyond that big division, then we open up the possibility of constructive punishment and authentic forgiveness. The people like criminals are not radically different from you and me. That gives them hope, and that gives us humility. And all the work of Sister Helen Prejean is really based on this insight. We are all human beings. Some people have done wrong. Their actions are wrong. But that does not mean their existence is wrong. That does not mean their existence is unchanging. And that is what I think will be presented in the Opera House. As long as we divide the world into us and them, we're going to be against them. And the real danger in that is that we will become like what we fight against. That's what I've been saying to Suleiman. If you're just against these people, these intelligence officers, these policemen, you're going to become like them. And so it's essential that each one of us define ourselves not so much by what we're against, but by what we're for. And I think that's, to me, the deepest dynamic of forgiveness. For letting your life be defined by who and what you're for. Letting our society, our country, Canada, be defined not by who we're against region, or whatever, but by who and what we're for. Thank you.
Time for a few questions. Maybe I'll get started and give you a further opportunity to formulate your own. As I recall, you began your talk this evening, Mary Jo, identifying Canada as a forgiving society. And I'm wondering if you could just, in a nutshell, give us the criteria for a statement like that. And is there another society, for example, a society to our south, to the south of us, that is not a forgiving society? How do we judge societies?
Well, I was just giving you Adrienne Clarkson's. And if you just, I'll go back to the first statement. I think what she's saying, we're forgiving with 4 centuries of give and take, of compromise, acceptance, wrongdoing. The Japanese Canadians would be an example. A wrongdoing that you try to redress. You can't completely, but there's that effort there of not letting a wrong of the past drive the future. Certainly, the punitive, the punishing society seems to be growing in the United States at this time. And I've read, in the studies that I've read, preparing this talk actually, the question is asked, why the fear, why the concern about crime and about guns when the statistics are that crime is just much, much less, say in a place like New York City and elsewhere. And well, it's here too though. Gosh, I was listening to Don Cherry last night. Forget about rehabilitation, just throw them in jail and keep them off the streets. But I think what she's done in this speech and what I've tried to do is say, these really are 2 different ways of proceeding. You never find a pure forgiving society or a pure punitive society, because certainly there's some wonderful, amazing, including Sister Helen herself, things going on in the United States today. But this helps to make us more conscious of the ways that we deal with each other. Yes?
What would be an example
What would be an example of constructive punishment? I actually skipped over that because I saw I was running out of time. But at Romero House, we get quite a few community service kids. So these would have been juveniles or first offenders who've been convicted of something, like having a joint or whatever, something. And so they're assigned community service with us, like 40 hours of community service. And so I take this quite seriously. I usually meet with this kid and say, you know, what you did in some way has injured the community, the society. And so the community service is your chance to rebuild it, to help build the community, not to take it apart. So that's point one. And the second thing in the community service is to say, we really need you to do this. We're not just and we try to make the work, so it's not just pushing the sawdust from this side of the floor to that side of the floor. That's not constructive. We need these 6 rooms painted by the weekend because we're expecting a family. Do it. You know, in other words, it matters. So the consequential notion. And then finally, to say to this person, you know, what you did is wrong, but you're a good person, and you can do better. Now, to me, that's, as I see it, you know, about 75% of the kids, that's going to be their first, last, and only. I think that's constructive. Now, it gets more complicated as the crimes get more complicated, but the component parts of it, I think, are wise.
I have a question for which I might be short on my phone.
Oh, no, this is not.
What I have observed, and I'm sure a lot of people have observed, that as people become more and more born again religious, Christians, Muslims, whatever, they become more and more punishing. They keep bringing out more and more of their grievances and lock them up, forget about them. And all the liberal people, most of the liberal people anyway, are the ones who stay away from religion. And they are more of the forgiving kind. Am I wrong, or is there something in that?
Did everybody hear that? That as people become more religious or fundamentalist, they're more punishing, and as they're more liberal, they're more forgiving. I sort of agree, but don't.
Well, the example is Texas and New York.
Yeah. Just because a liberal person is tolerant or anything goes, that doesn't mean that's forgiveness. Okay, there's something quite different there. And I think it's true in some cases about there's a certain kind of religion that is very punishing. But I wouldn't want to generalize, because I know people, evangelical Christians, who are, their whole faith is based on the experience of forgiveness. So I wouldn't want to generalize, but there's something in what you're saying. Okay. Yes?
So coming back to your Turkish friend there, and what you said about him having this in his head,
Yeah.
keeping it in his head, and it was keeping him paralyzed, or however you want to put it. I'm speaking out of my background as a counselor, working in the addiction field particularly, and also working in the prison system. And I don't know if this adds to this, but this is my understanding, that people continue with that. You can't forget the past, but if you continue with it, you keep it in your head. You have, I know what you said, letting go of it. But the point I want to make is not to let that have power over you anymore.
Yeah.
That's what continues, that it continues to have power over you. And that's your choice.
Yeah,
to let that happen.
exactly.
Because I think what was happening with your life.
Yeah, it's determining your life.
Yep.
There's a really fine Croatian theologian by the name of Miroslav Volf, who's writing out of that particular conflict. And I think the phrase he uses, it's not a question of forgetting, but of remembering in a different way. To remember in a different way. Michael?
Hey, Joyce. Thank you for your presentation. It's very helpful in Calgary. We're not making but I think many people here would agree that we're at a turning point here in Calgary where we are in danger of being very inhospitable, especially to refugees. I think of people from, most recently from Sudan. You'll notice with all of us here, there are very few ethnic minorities. And I think that in Alberta, there is a lot of us versus them based on economic status and what neighborhood you live in. And especially, it's a very difficult place to be poor in. And we do have I don't want to be too strident, but we do have a very strong animus at City Hall to cleanse the downtown area of homeless people. And what I'm wondering about is, this is an impossible question to answer, but what does it take for people like all of us who are here to cultivate within this society the inclusivity you talk about, the gradual elimination of us versus them? Could you just speak to that? I'm not asking you to solve our problems as much as to challenge us to take from what we have heard tonight something that will invite us to be in a different way in this particular city.
Did everybody hear the question? How to deal with the us and them in Calgary. Maybe I'll just go back to a conversation we had at supper, and I was talking about my experience at the beginning of Romero House when we, these 4 little houses move into this little neighborhood, and people really wanted to run us out. So it wasn't very nice. And the bottom line is, they just heard refugee houses are coming in, and at one point they organized, went down to City Hall because we were going to fix the door on our garage, I think, and said, there are going to be drug dealers and prostitution and crime and escalation, and it was just... Now, 15 years later, the whole neighborhood is involved in welcoming people. They get the jobs, they get the clothes, they invite people for supper. We have a street party together. So it's like, how does that happen? And I don't think there's a quick fix, but I think it is when people are close enough that they begin to see each other face to face. And when somebody offers to shovel your walk. It's that simple. And I've come to see now that our whole social service system is based on a kind of view where we pay taxes to the government, who then gives it to different agencies to look after them. And in the process, there really is an us and them. And the government's sort of in the middle. And so you don't really see them, but your taxes are going. So that's where the tax issue comes in. But many, socially conscious people say, well, let's keep the taxes high so we can have the services for them. But even what is happening is people never see each other. So to me, in terms of a fundamental issue of social policy is to create social spaces in which people can meet each other. So one of the fundamental things there would be mixed housing and mixed neighborhoods. If you create ghettos, all the poor live here and all the rich live here, and money goes from there to the government to look after and have community organizers there, whatever happens to them, it really doesn't matter. And not because, I could just see, not because people are bad people. They just don't know each other. Now, I know that sounds pretty simple, but
No, it's very helpful.
it's, you have to, for example, in Toronto, the greatest crime neighborhoods are the ghettos, that all these big things that have just grown up. Really successful developments are like the St. Lawrence Market area, where there really is mixed income housing, and it's mutually supportive and beneficial. And as I was saying at supper, if you have a healthy, functioning neighborhood, I now see my main job is to make a good neighborhood. If you have a good neighborhood, you don't need social workers, you don't need employment counselors, people do it for each other. And then it's good not just for refugees, like the elderly people on our street, we're their Meals on Wheels. Everybody looks after them. So if it works for one, it works for everybody. Yes?
I think that's quite idealistic. What I have seen in Albert, so people come from different countries, they want to live with their own people. And I certainly was conscious of that at Christmas. And we weren't allowed to say Merry Christmas because they didn't celebrate Christmas when we did. They were to keep cling to their own culture and not mingle with our culture in inviting country. And I think that, I'm thinking one way, the Americans, where they have a melting pot, people don't go in their own together. It's part of our own people. But, so I think it's the immigrants coming in that create this as much as the people in Kansas.
I protest.
Just summarize that and respond.
I think what you're saying, it's around the issue of Christmas, that if you feel, if immigrant groups stick together, which I think can be good, but also the mixed housing thing is very important there. I think for people to begin to feel confident to go out of their group and to mix with other people. But I think the issue of Christmas, my heavens, everybody says Merry Christmas, everybody says Happy Hanukkah and Happy Eid. I mean, it goes back to the liberal thing. Just to say we're not going to mention anything about anything doesn't really solve the problem. Yes?
I was just thinking, when you say make a healthy community, you're drawing an arbitrary boundary around that community. So how do we get those communities to ripple out into all of the city, all of Canada, and all of the world? Because that's ultimately, we don't want that line anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Well, yes and no, because I think to have there's a certain scale to creating a community, a neighborhood, and you have to work within a certain scale. If it's too big, it just doesn't function. So I would say this little neighborhood is about maybe 1,000 people. And I think statistically that's about the right size for a functioning social unit, which doesn't mean it's exclusive, but it just provides a base for people.
Time for maybe one more question?
Yes.
I feel personally, as though in the last 7 or 8 weeks, that we
We've taken an immersion course in punishment the last 7 or 8 weeks. How did that happen? Is the question. How does it just flip? I think that's a very profound question. How does a society flip into being a punishing society?
Or seems to accept emotions.
Okay. To me, some of this issue is around political leadership, but some is just us, because we can't keep blaming political leaders. You know, we get the leaders we deserve, I think. So, you know, they're as good or as bad as we. So, it seems to me that it's a really bad sign in a society or country when this sort of punitive punishing thing goes into play, because it says we're beginning to define ourselves by who we're against. And it's a sign that the vision of what a country's for, what it's about, is weak when you have to. And I do believe this is what's happening in the US at this time. That this nation, which was built on such a powerful vision of the republic, you know, liberty and justice for all, and a constitution, and what it's for, that has so diminished that the country's like held together by what it's against. It's against communism, against terrorism, against crime, against, you know, all of that serves as social cohesion because the social vision is weakened. And so that it's not a good sign. And politicians can play into that. It's very easy to do it. It's much more difficult for any of us, or anybody in our own lives, to say, you know, about Canada, this is what I'm for. This is what I care about. This is what I have a great affection for. This is what I believe in. You know, to operate out of that instead of. And that's a good note to end.
I want to thank you, Mary Jo, for coming back to Calgary and for giving us lots to chew on. I think we could all feel like we'd like to vote again, maybe, or something. But she will be speaking again tomorrow at the University of Calgary. You're welcome to come then as well. I hope you'll stay behind. Get her to sign a book for you, enjoy some refreshments, mingle. She's given us much to chew on this evening. I want to acknowledge somebody in the audience this evening. This is the Kasuo Iwassa lecture on ethics and urban theology. And I'm pleased to welcome Mrs. Iwassa this evening. Would you please stand for us, please? This lecture is named in honor of her husband, who served in Calgary for many years, and it's our pleasure to have you here tonight as well. So thanks for coming. One more comment.
One more comment.
I guess I want to say on behalf of Calgary Opera, I want to thank Douglas for, as the chair of Christian Thought, bringing this wonderful speaker to us, and to thank Mary Jo for that incredibly inspiring address. I can see why we were turning people away at the door. Anybody who had heard her before or heard about what a wonderful speaker she was. obviously would want to hear her again. So thank you so much. I also want to apologize for our having to turn people away, and so if you know any of the people that were not able to make it into the hall tonight, could you please pass on our apologies? The fire marshal only allows 175 people in the hall, unfortunately, and you people who regularly attend these Christian thought lectures apparently are very enthusiastic, and you don't RSVP. And we didn't know that, and so we severely underestimated the number of people that were going to show up. So that was unfortunate, but it was a tremendous evening, and I thank you all for coming out and supporting this event. I just want to...
It's okay. You just jogged my memory. These lectures are going to have full text on the web.
Oh, great.
So I'm just feeling badly for those that couldn't make it.
Great.
So go to the University of Calgary website and follow the Chair of Christian Thought, and in a couple of weeks maybe? By Friday, we'll have the full text of tonight's lecture and tomorrow's on the web.
Okay, terrific. I don't feel quite so bad. I just want to remind you that there is one more community event, another partnership with the Department of Drama at U of C tomorrow night. If you'd like to come back here tomorrow night, it's a reading of John Herbert's Fortunate and Men's Eyes at 7:30 here. And of course, I hope you will attend or consider attending our production of Dead Man Walking. It is going to be an enormously powerful opera. 3 performances, Saturday, January 28th, Wednesday, February 1st, and Friday, February 3rd. People who have attended the event, I guess it was last Friday, will have heard me say this before, but I think it bears repeating. When Sister Helen was asked what she thought about her book being made into an opera, one of her comments was that music can take you to places in your heart that you didn't know existed, and she was apparently very pleased that this was being produced as an opera. It is a very powerful opera, like tonight's presentation.